My Uncle Vance told a room full of relatives that I, his own niece, was not seen as a success in the family. He said it loud, proud, and with a smile. 5 years later, I signed the papers to buy his company. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Hazel. Grab your coffee, because today's drama is absolutely next level. This story was sent in by a viewer named Delaney, and I promise you, every single detail is jaw-dropping. So let's set the scene. Delaney grew up in a family where success was basically treated like a sport. Her grandfather, a self-made man named Oswin, had built a regional manufacturing company from scratch in the 1970s. Oswin's fabrications became the backbone of the entire extended family's lifestyle and identity. When Oswin retired, he split management between his two sons, Delaney's father Clement and her uncle Vance. Now here's where it gets interesting. Clement was the quiet, steady, methodical one who kept the books clean. Vance, on the other hand, was all charm and bluster, the guy who loved the title more than the actual work. Vance wore expensive suits. He drove a car that cost more than most people's first homes. He told anyone who'd listen that he was the reason the company survived, even though Clement ran daily operations. Now, Delaney was always different. She wasn't interested in joining the family firm right away. She went off to study finance at university, something Vance thought was, quote, a waste of a seat. Vance believed only people who worked the factory floor deserved any real respect. Degrees were for pretenders, he'd say. Every family gathering, he'd corner Delaney and ask when she was going to get a real job, while her cousins, Vance's kids, Broderick and Felicia, were handed cushy roles in the company straight out of school. No interviews, no competition, just nepotism wrapped in a bow and called keeping it in the family. Delaney watched this quietly and said nothing. She was playing a much longer game. She graduated top of her class, took an investment analyst role at a mid-sized private equity firm called Harrow Capital. She worked brutal hours, 14, 15-hour days. She learned how companies were valued, bought, broken apart, and rebuilt. She became genuinely brilliant at identifying undervalued or mismanaged businesses, the kind that look stable but are quietly rotting. Now here's where our villain, Vance, starts digging his own grave and doesn't even notice. About 3 years into Delaney's career at Harrow, her father Clement called her, voice tight with worry. He said Vance had been pushing to buy out Clement's share of the company, systematically, quietly, for over a year. Vance had been whispering to the board, yes, there was a small board of outside advisors, that Clement was losing it. He planted seeds. Said Clement was too conservative, too scared, blocking growth. He was staging a slow-motion coup. Clement, a gentle and trusting man, had no idea the knives had been out for that long. Delaney flew home. She sat with her father. She looked through the financials, and her blood went cold. Vance had been siphoning company resources, subtle, almost surgical, consulting fees to shell companies tied to his son Broderick, inflated vendor contracts with suppliers who turned out to be connected to Vance's personal associates. The company, on paper, looked okay, but underneath, it was hemorrhaging money through a dozen quiet wounds. And Vance was about to use a coming cash flow dip to pressure Clement into selling at a severely undervalued price. Delaney sat very still for a long moment. Then she opened her laptop, and she started doing what she did best. She ran a full independent valuation of Oswin's fabrications. She documented every irregularity she found. She catalogued the vendor discrepancies, the shell company trails, the inflated fees, everything, with receipts. Then she called a meeting with her father and also quietly, very quietly, contacted a friend at a forensic accounting firm. While Vance was busy putting on his expensive suit and planning his victory lap, Delaney was building a case. Let's pause here because I want you to appreciate the sheer audacity of what Vance was doing. This man called his own niece the family failure. At a holiday dinner table, in front of everyone, he said, and I quote, "Delaney plays with spreadsheets. The rest of us build real things." He laughed. His children laughed. Some aunts looked at the floor. Clement said nothing out of politeness. Delaney smiled and said, "You're probably right, Uncle Vance." And then she refilled her wineglass. She was already 3 moves ahead at that point. She just hadn't shown her hand yet. Okay, now we're getting to the part of the story I live for. The revenge. The absolutely cold, brilliant revenge. Delaney went back to her firm and proposed something that initially surprised her partners at Harrow Capital. She wanted to acquire Oswin's fabrications. She presented her case. The real numbers, the hidden mismanagement, the true asset value. Her argument was this: strip away the theft and the mismanagement, and the underlying business was actually solid. Good equipment, established client contracts, reliable workers who'd been there for decades and were deeply loyal to Clement. With proper management, meaning without Vance, it was a genuinely profitable investment. Harrow Capital agreed. They authorized her to lead the acquisition. Delaney would be the point person. Step 1. She approached the board of advisors directly, without telling Vance, and presented the forensic accounting findings. The board was stunned. They had suspected something was off, but seeing it laid out so precisely was devastating. 2 of the outside advisors had actually raised concerns internally before. They'd been dismissed by Vance personally. Now they had documentation. Now they had a path forward. And Delaney handed it to them on a silver platter. Step 2. Harrow Capital made an official acquisition offer to all shareholders, including both Clement and Vance. But here's the genius part. The offer to Clement was structured to give him an ongoing advisory role, a guaranteed income, and full respect. The offer to Vance was structured very, very differently, because Delaney had flagged the financial irregularities to the board already. The board's lawyers sent Vance a private letter. They outlined what they'd found. They outlined what it could mean legally. They gave him a choice: accept the acquisition offer at current, fair, not inflated, market valuation, and step down quietly. Or they would pursue a full forensic audit, file with regulatory bodies, and explore personal liability for the shell company transfers. Vance hired a lawyer. The lawyer reviewed the evidence Delaney had assembled, and then the lawyer told him to take the deal. I want you to picture Vance's face in that moment. The man in the expensive suit, the man who laughed at spreadsheets, being told by his own attorney that the failure of the family had him completely cornered. Vance signed. He walked away from the company his father built, with a settlement that looked okay on paper. But he lost the title. He lost the control. He lost the income streams he'd built through those shady vendor deals. His son Broderick lost his made-up vice president role. His daughter Felicia lost her management position. The consulting fees dried up. The expense account evaporated. The empire Vance had quietly been stealing from was gone. And who was now running point on the newly acquired Oswin's Fabrications for Harrow Capital. Delaney, age 29, with the title of Integration Director and the full backing of the firm behind her. Clement was brought back as a paid senior consultant, valued, respected, doing meaningful work without the stress of Vance's schemes. The workers kept their jobs. The company stabilized within 18 months under proper oversight. It became genuinely profitable. And Vance? He called Delaney once. Just once. She let it go to voicemail. She never returned the call. She said she didn't need a confrontation. She didn't need an apology. The paperwork said everything she'd ever needed to say. Okay, I need to take a sip of coffee before I get into this next part. Because this story deserves a real dissection. Let's talk about Vance. Because he is such a textbook example of a specific and incredibly dangerous personality type. Vance is what psychologists often call a covert, grandiose narcissist, wrapped in a very loud, performative exterior. See, the obvious narcissist is easy to spot. They brag constantly. They demand attention. They're exhausting at parties. But Vance was doing something more sophisticated and more insidious. He was managing perception while quietly extracting resources. He performed competence. He wore the suit, used the jargon, worked the room. But he wasn't building. He was extracting. And he chose Delaney as his designated scapegoat for a very specific reason. She was the threat he couldn't control. Delaney wasn't inside the company where he could manage her narrative. She was out in the world, becoming genuinely excellent. So he preemptively painted her as a disappointment, convinced the family to overlook her before she could become a real contender. This is a classic move in family systems with a narcissistic authority figure. Label the competent one. Elevate the dependent ones. Broderick and Felicia weren't given roles because they were capable. They were given roles because they were controllable. They owed their status to Vance. They would never challenge him. That's exactly the kind of loyalty he needed. Meanwhile, Clement, the genuinely good man at the center of all this, was being slowly strangled financially and reputationally. Vance had spent years making Clement look soft, overly cautious, out of touch, to the people Clement trusted most. This is the cruelest part of the story to me. Not the money, the systematic erosion of a good man's reputation. Vance didn't just want Clement's share of the company. He wanted to feel like he'd earned it, by comparison. And here is where the revenge becomes genuinely brilliant on a psychological level, not just a practical one. Delaney didn't scream. She didn't expose Vance at a family dinner. She didn't post about it online. She used the exact tools Vance dismissed as useless: finance, analysis, patience, documentation, to dismantle him completely. That is what makes this revenge so satisfying on a deep level. She spoke his language back to him. Vance believed power was loud. Power was the title. Power was the suit and the car and the family table position. Delaney showed him that real power is quiet. It's numbers. It's evidence. It's a legal brief from a very good attorney. And I want to talk about the moment she let his call go to voicemail, because I think that's actually the most powerful moment. She had nothing left to prove to him. That phone going unanswered wasn't cold, it was just complete. She had already received everything she needed from this situation. His acknowledgement was irrelevant to her by then. That is emotional maturity at its absolute peak, not needing the last word when the actions have already spoken. There's a lesson here about what happens when you systematically underestimate someone who is quietly and seriously paying attention. Vance thought Delaney was background noise. He thought she was a minor character in the story of his success. He never considered that she was, in fact, the main character, and she'd been reading the whole script for years. There's also something really important to note about how Delaney handled her father throughout all of this. She didn't just burn it all down for the revenge. She structured the entire thing to protect Clement with a role and dignity. That tells you everything about who Delaney is. This wasn't just revenge, it was restoration. She restored her father's dignity, his income, his standing, while simultaneously and legally removing the person who'd been poisoning everything. That's not petty revenge, that's justice, executed with precision and genuine care for collateral damage. And I think the lesson that hits hardest here is this: the people who mock your tools don't understand your battlefield. Vance saw spreadsheets as weakness. He saw finance as something soft, something removed from real work. But in 2024, financial literacy is one of the most powerful forces in the modern world. And Delaney knew that. She didn't need a louder voice, she needed a more accurate one. And she had it. If you take one thing from Delaney's story, let it be this: don't announce your moves, just make them. Stay quiet. Build in silence. Let the paperwork do the talking when the time is right. Because the most devastating thing you can do to someone who called you a failure is simply succeed. Massively. Quietly. And if success just happens to come with their name on the company acquisition documents, well, that's just a bonus. All right, I want to hear from you in the comments right now because I have a question that's been on my mind. Has someone in your life ever completely underestimated you and later had to watch you surpass everything they thought you couldn't do? Drop your story below because honestly the comments on these videos are their own entire drama series and I love it. If you're new here and this is your first Hazel video, hi, welcome, you found your people, hit that subscribe button. We post new stories every week: revenge, family drama, malicious compliance, all the good stuff your lunch break deserves. I'm Hazel. Stay cozy, stay caffeinated, and remember, the best revenge really is living and thriving well.